Jeremy is a sort of serial movement builder, one of the architects of Avaz, co-founded Purpose, and has then built lots of organisations that you might have heard of, like More in Common and others. And we're delighted to be able to have him here over from America to talk about power in the age of AI, populism and chaos. And we deliberately chose that title because it's broad enough for us to talk about pretty much anything, but I think we will cover those bases. I actually wanted to start with you, Jeremy, and pick up on something very, very topical, which is what's happened in the last 24 hours in America, and the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And probably many of you won't know who this person is, other than probably what you've heard in the last 24 hours, but it's also going to potentially unleash something quite powerful. But I think it does say something about how power works in our society today. So I wonder whether you wouldn't mind just talking us through who he is, but also how you think this is now going to play out.
Yeah, great to be here, Ravi, and great to be with all of you. Look, this assassination is what it seems like of Charlie Kirk, who, for those of you who don't know him, is a kind of very well-known right-wing activist in the US who sort of built this big infrastructure, which is part of how young people in the US have sort of come back to conservatism and to the right. And he's very, very, very well networked with the far right and with the Trump administration and that whole ecosystem. And it's obviously incredibly disturbing and tragic what has happened to him. And I think the moment is quite interesting and instructive in terms of like where we are in general. So I think firstly, I think it's notable that the political culture in the US is so corrosive that almost immediately after this event, people have moved into using it, I think, on both sides as sort of an opportunity to further the divide, right? So I think it's fair to say that I've seen a lot of the progressive social media influencers, particularly young people, actually be like celebrating this. I mean, that is happening. There is some of that going on. Not people leading big organizations, but there is some, I think, quite disturbing, just kind of, this was a bad guy, so therefore we kind of are going to make a joke immediately about it. And I think that says something about where we are in terms of the political discourse in the US, the feeling, the temperature in the US. But I think also on the right, we're very quickly seeing how this is going to be weaponized. And so I was mentioning to you earlier, Ravi, that Blake Masters, who is a close affiliate of Peter Thiel, who unsuccessfully ran for Senate in Arizona, kind of far-right tech influencer, he immediately tweeted, without even knowing, by the way, who was responsible for this event, we need to go after all the NGOs, go after all the foundations, go after all the people funding progressive causes, because if we don't do it, they'll come to us. And this immediate conflation of totally non-violent kind of political activity with violence, I think that's really indicative of what could come here. And I do have real concerns that they will use this event, and the administration will use this event to really accelerate efforts to target the progressive infrastructure of the United States, political actors, nonprofits, foundations, who are already under attack and fearful. But I think this event will turn the temperature up even further.
And there's a broader trend here whereby any given event, like October the 7th, or even further back with things like 9/11, it creates its own dynamic. And it's almost impossible to control. And that dynamic is even more turbocharged with the way in which social media works today. If you're trying to actually calm the temperature down and avoid that sort of vortex, what can people do? And is it just an impossible dynamic?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think just to stick with the October 7 example, because I think it was a similar moment where as soon as October 7 happened, people got very tribal, right? I mean, again, before people had even been able to absorb the tragedy, there were people on social media either posting, "I stand with Israel," and that was the kind of meme that emerged immediately after, or posting, immediately in a way that was that sort of jumped ahead to being very hostile to Israel. And so that, again, I think shows you something about the way people sort of sort themselves into teams very quickly and then just look for information that they can share that backs up their team's position. And so it's very difficult to find a constituency that actually says, this is tragic, and that sits in what should be a kind of lens of common humanity first. I think in terms of what can do that, it's not clear algorithmically right now how you do that. Because part of the challenge is that, as we know well, these machines are optimized for that tribal team-based dynamic. And, we in our book, New Power, we talk about this sort of how intensity is more important than favorability in the current dynamic. So, and that's for institutions, it's for politicians, people who can generate intensity, are more effective and command attention better than people who can command broad agreement, but that agreement is relatively weak. And so I think until we shift the way the algorithms reward this behavior, the favorability camp, right, which inherently is going to have to acknowledge nuance, complexity, and common humanity, is quite hard to tap, right? And I think there are moments of that. I mean, I do think the moment after the death of that young Syrian boy in 2015 that led to the Refugees Welcome movement, there was a lot of common humanity in that sentiment, right? It was a positive campaign. There was no hostility inherently directed at anyone as part of that, but more people showing up with flowers at train stations. We are a very long way from that in 2025, but you see the glimpses of campaigns where the kind of core idea is common humanity and universal values. And obviously we want to try to find more of those moments, as difficult as this moment that we're in now is.
And do you see campaigns that have any potency? Because those sorts of things never seem as intense as the more tribal affiliations where you activate a sort of real us v them identity. Being all Kumbaya-ish can feel a little bit, lame, basically.
Well, exactly. So I think what was instructive about that campaign, and again, so as we think about ways to try to replicate the power of that was quite a powerful moment. It was a real social movement. It produced big policy changes very quickly. Merkel's decision to accept those Syrian refugees, I don't think would have happened in the absence of that movement. Even the UK reluctantly, I think, budged policy-wise in that window. Now, that was in light of an incredibly tragic event that was highly visual. People saw that tragic image of that young boy washed up ashore, and that led to that big outpouring of energy. So I do think and that energy was not hostile and it was not directed against the anti-migration forces, but it was very much about supporting these people as human beings. So I think you do see those moments happen, but I do think, 2015, that era, it would be hard to replicate that even now because of the way the social media environment has changed. I think one really interesting thing that I ask myself at the moment is it even possible right now for a big progressive social movement like Black Lives Matter or Me Too to emerge in the current environment? And because the technology platforms at that time, Twitter and Facebook in particular, there was a lot of pressure on them to both screen out extreme hate speech, and they're actually, progressive messages and ideas and values were still in the ascendancy. And the right was on those platforms, of course, but the dominant voices in many ways were those progressive voices. What's changed now is both the right-wing voices are much better organized, and they're actually more what we would call new power in their energy than the progressive voices. But the platforms themselves have both decided that hate speech is fine for the most part, and B, those platforms have algorithmically shifted to really allow that right-wing sentiment and content to become ascendant. That's a very clear decision that Twitter has made, or X, but also I think Meta has shifted in that direction.
So you're saying even if the left was better organised, they still may not get currency in the current sort of structure of the social media companies. Now,
Exactly.
Now, we could talk more about sort of how do you fix that, different business models, etc. But I just want to come on to AI, because in some ways that's disrupting this again, and it could disrupt it in a very negative way with even more deep fakes, misinformation, making all this much worse. But there is also a potentially more optimistic view of AI perhaps being a counter to misinformation. Do you want to give us let's start with the optimistic case, given it's the theme of what we're trying to do today.
Yes, okay. So look, I mean, we don't know yet how AI is going to play out, obviously, for people. But here's the sort of mild case for optimism on this. So right now, as I mentioned earlier, our information environment, our opinions, our emotions are dominated by what happens in social media. And we know that story well, right? It's the story we've just been talking about of polarization, of extremism, of intensity. Now, as I think one of the big shifts that is coming is that people's information environment is going to be increasingly dominated by their relationships with their AI assistants, right? What we recently in Harvard Business Review called people's digital significant others. A lot of people I know are already forming intimate, emotional, and intellectual and psychological relationships with these digital assistants, right? I mean, I know people who, walk home from work every day and chit chat with ChatGPT, literally out loud, the way they would with a lover or a therapist, right? So
this is such a New York story, though.
It's such a New York story. Maybe you Brits are going to hold the line for an extra year or two. But the implication of that is that what these assistants tell you about the world, about the events in the news, about all of this is going to shape, as social media has in large part, your trajectory, right, politically and emotionally. And what the big difference between social media and the AI chatbots at the moment is that the economic and the kind of incentive for social media, because it's attentional, right, is about extremism. So the things they surface are shocking and scandalous. But the currency for this relationship you build with your AI assistant is more like comfort, intimacy, soothing, reassurance, trust, right? That's what keeps you stuck to your digital significant other. And so what that tends to mean is that the information you get from your assistant doesn't tend to be inflammatory. It tends to be quite balanced and nuanced. Now, it does mirror you a lot, right? So if you're very right-wing, it will sound more Trumpian, and if you're a Jeremy Corbyn supporter, it will use the language of Jeremy Corbyn. Like, it will mirror you. But it also, does tend to calm you down, pipe you down, and it's programmed as now, in general, to kind of bring you a little bit back from the extremes. Mm-hmm. So I think that if you imagine a world where instead of 90% of your information environment being the swamp of social media, to a world where maybe the majority of your information environment is being shaped by this very intimate relationship, that you might see a less polarized world, you might see a little bit of a cooling down because of that shift. Mm-hmm. Now, there's obviously a big asterisk. and the asterisk is that a few people are going to basically, in many ways, control whether that's true. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, if we are headed to a world where, the experience is mediated through a few of these different large technology players, OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, etc., their choices about the parameters, the guardrails, and the kind of skew of these relationships, like in the last generation with social media, but perhaps even more so, is going to determine where we land on that question.
Mm-hmm. And given where those are located, i.e. in America, isn't there a sort of big danger that in the current sort of environment that those are conceived in the Trumpian image and therefore it's foisted upon the rest of the world in some way? If you're a Trump administration person, how do you see this as an opportunity to reinforce your power?
I think it's already happening, right? So, for example, Meta, under huge political pressure, recently appointed someone as a DEI advisor or something, or anti-DEI advisor, who was responsible for spreading crazy homophobic and transphobic conspiracy theories. So already we're seeing that they're under pressure not just to like moderate the direction, but actually to actively sort of tilt the scales, right? So I think that is happening. I think it is true that the tech players, and you think of them individually because it's a very personalistic in many ways, right? But the big tech CEOs, people like Sam Altman, obviously Musk and others, have all shifted to the right and have all made big efforts to align themselves with this new political order. That said, I do think these guys are not that politically sophisticated, and they are moving quite malleably and quickly, right? So Mark Zuckerberg, 7 or 8 years ago, was pandering in the opposite direction. His employees, this is also true of Google, were very effectively pressuring him on issues of identity, diversity, etc. And then they sort of swung in a big way now, in a way that I think is actually maybe not wise, because it's such an extreme shift, right, that it makes them vulnerable to what happens when Democrats get back and perhaps try to do a bigger regulatory push to rein them in. But I think that ideologically, they're very malleable. The shift to the right that has happened has been, none of these people were left-wing at the beginning, but they've been radicalized into this new and quite strange ideology over a relatively quick period. And some of that has been documented in the role of group chats that some of these key tech leaders were in with right-wing influences that shaped their ideological conversion. So I think that gives us hope for maybe shifting some of that back to a more sane place at some level. But obviously there's going to be a lot of hard power here. And at the moment, the hard power is with the US administration. And so that's part of why we're seeing the dynamics that we're seeing.
So if you're in the UK government right now and you're thinking, we don't want to make the same mistake we'd made with the internet or with social media and had a sort of excessive optimism, this will all turn out beautifully. Let's try and shape this market and structure its evolution in the right way. What can you do?
I mean, I think, you clearly need a strong kind of antitrust type lens would be one of my views, which is don't allow for the concentration of the user base and the models to be in the hands of 3 or 4 companies. So if you think about the user experience of somebody, if you're in the OpenAI ecosystem, right, you're really dependent on them. And it's going to be the barriers to exit. Like if you've built a relationship with your digital significant other and it's an OpenAI one, it's very hard for you to leave. They know everything about you. You feel connected to them. They're more and more useful to you. I mean, it sounds funny, but it's coming, right? And so I think that's where an
do you have a digital significant other, Jeremy?
I have not named that person. Some people have. Some people have named them. I'm resisting.
Okay, sorry.
I'm resisting, but not without the temptation, okay. Ravi. It's the tentacles are reaching for me, right? So I think definitely trying to break up the dependence on a few tech companies would be one big piece. And then secondly, one thing that regulators totally failed to do in the social media era was apply any public interest test or restrictions to the algorithmic choices that were made by the companies themselves. So in the end, the ranking engineers at Meta, the people responsible for deciding how the algorithms would or would not work, play this massive policy role that affected elections and our culture in ways that the regulators either didn't understand or didn't want to understand. And so to bring it back to the question you raised a moment ago, it's totally reasonable for regulators to impose appropriate restrictions on what the boundaries of what these AI assistants can and cannot tell you about things that have a big impact on the health of our societies and our democracy.
Great. We're going to come to questions in a few minutes. And I'm dying to ask my chair, who stood at the corner there, who was the former chief executive of Ofcom, one of those regulators asleep at the wheel while this all went off the rails, but maybe we can get him involved. I want to come back to something actually you said earlier on, which is about the left and the right being more organised and more able to sort of supply the material into the ecosystem. It does relate to a bigger question, which is why is it that we've had lots of right-wing populism, but very little very successful left-wing populism, and what would have to change in the next few years for us to see actual left-wing populists succeed? Because yes, it's bubbling up in various different countries, but it's nowhere near as potent or as effective as the right. And is it just that, as well as the structural economic issues, we've got migration that tilts the whole field to the right, or is it something else about the left-right ecosystem?
Yeah, well, I think that as you say, migration is obviously a massive dynamic, and in general, the right has proved very skillful at leveraging identity politics. So what you're seeing now in the US, it's extraordinary how much the right, including in the 2024 election, has used the trans issue. And they've begun to tell a story to people that trans people are responsible for all of society's ills, for all the cultural change that you're uncomfortable with. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying, the efforts to create the distraction that the trans issue represents by dehumanizing a whole group of people. Not a new tactic, a very old tactic by right-wing populists, but one that is really effectively amplified in the current information environment. So I think that they're exploiting a lot of identity beyond just migration, right? But migration and general race, sort of racial animosities is key to that. So there was a recent incident in the US just a few weeks ago where very tragically a young white woman was killed by a black man on a train in North Carolina. And that has been weaponized in extraordinarily dangerous ways to basically try to incite a race war in the US online. And so I think we're going to see more and more of that. And identity, I think, is key to that challenge. Now, I think it's worth noting that identity-based movements were very much ascended, as I mentioned earlier, on the left until recently. Black Lives Matter and other movements. But I think that the way those movements played out was not helpful to the values that many people in this room might share. Because I think that the identity politics that became very popular on the left in the 2010s into the early 2020s came across as very judgy. Only people with a certain kind of oppression or were legitimate, and everybody else was sort of depicted as being part of the problem, which made it very hard to create an inclusive sort of solidarity-based movement. So there were big problems with the identity politics, in my view, on the left, which the right are now exploiting. So to come back to your question on left-wing populism, clearly left-wing populism driven by identity politics, probably not the way to go. Economic populism on the left obviously has more potential, for the left. And so the question is what form that takes. And I hate to cite this, but I think you see a glimpse of that in the, again, quite disturbing reaction to the killing of the healthcare executive in the US, the Luigi Mangione case, where people turned him into an anti-hero, again, I think quite disturbingly. But what that shows is that if you can create a sense of anger at the obvious injustices that exist in the system, and that you can show that the right, and I think this is true of the Trump economic policy, is really in cahoots with all of those powerful interests, that there is a potential to build off the back of that anger something that might feel a little bit more optimistic and hopeful, which is what Mamdani in New York is trying to do right now, which is to create a kind of sunny, optimistic left-wing populism. Yeah. His tone is positive, he's warm, and therefore it doesn't feel like the angry left-wing populism that you might see, say, in France with a Mélenchon.
Yeah. So my final question before we go to questions from the audience is, for centrist politicians, they're sort of betting on what you might call deliverism. That if they just deliver on reducing migration, make growth a little bit better, improve the NHS, that'll basically work. and it will snuff out the oxygen of the populists. And I'm just wondering whether you think that's absolutely right, basically, or is it naive, given the sort of the way in which the information environment's changed. I think the other thing I'd love you to draw on is also the role of broad church parties. So we've got this weird situation now where essentially we've got a first past the post system, but we're now fragmented into more of a continental system in terms of narrower niches, or we're on the way to doing that. Can broad church parties even survive in this environment?
Yeah. Remind me the first part of your question.
First one's like deliverism.
That's right.
Essentially, if you just solve all these problems, will they all
Yeah, I think that the specificity there is that issues like affordability, which people really notice and can directly attribute to, they tend to blame the government when affordability goes up, when very specific prices in their lives go up. I think it's very clear. We have a lot of data that shows that if you, as a policymaker, can impact affordability and deliver policies that people see in their daily lives, bring down their rent or their energy prices or the groceries, that really does matter. And it might not matter in the sense that people are like, thank you, Keir Starmer, for doing that, but it might matter in the sense that it takes down the temperature and some of the anger. But I think that on larger policy issues where people feel the impacts more broadly rather than more specifically, and I would cite health system as an example, or education, I think it's harder to get the win from improving the NHS that you would get from lowering prices, because those effects are more broadly distributed and some people will experience them, but they're less likely to, I think, to give credit to governments for doing that. And so I think the deliverism thing has real limitations in the current environment. And what it means is that, you obviously need to get on with delivering as policymakers, but ceding the ground of ideas to a kind of metastasizing misinformation environment won't work. So you have to play the kind of new power game and make sure that you are really engaged in that battlefield and doing it effectively, as well as doing the kind of blocking and tackling, particularly on issues like affordability that people really do kind of notice.
And on migration, because I sometimes worry that the goalposts move, so you might halve migration levels or get it down, but then the campaign will be net zero migration or remigration now. Do you think that if there was a substantial reduction in both numbers and then the degree of control, that would filter into this issue becoming less salient and cutting off the oxygen of the right?
I'm less convinced on that. I mean, I think, there might be some impact, but I agree with you on goalposts. And I think that what you see even in places like the US, some of the places where there's highest levels of concerns about migration are places where there's very little migration.
Yeah.
And so that tells you a lot, right? I mean, in the Midwest in the United States, for example, there's some great hostility to migrants, and these are not the places where people are flooding across the borders. So yeah, I think that recognizing this delta between reality and the world that we live in, which is less unfortunately reflective of reality, is really necessary in this environment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeremy. Let's go to audience questions. Let's take 3 in a row. Yes, at the back, lady at the front, and then, should we go? Lady over there.
I feel sick, by the way, about this AI assistant thing. But just want to say, so given who owns these social media platforms and AI and everything, is there value to their owners, like to Musk, as an ideological vehicle? So his aim in owning X isn't to make money and drive engagement and get more users. It's as an ideological platform. So they would always prioritize that over profit. So even if you could get a load of people organizing around economic populism, they would never really encourage that, even if it would drive engagement and it was very intense, because the economic interests of Zuckerberg, even if he was like socially liberal, he would never want to support a wealth tax.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ravi. Sam Sharps from the Tony Blair Institute. Just a quick question, really, about the differences between the US and here. So a lot of the examples we talked about are all in America, and clearly lots of people here thinking about them. But we've got our own issues, problems, difficulties here. Do you see that as all symptomatic of exactly the same sort of process, or is there anything kind of specific to the US or specific to the UK that is different?
And the lady there. Yeah.
Thank you. I've been thinking a lot about how tribalism impacts long-termism, especially when political ideology almost becomes a lifestyle, especially on the left. And we see these short-term movements like Black Lives Matter in 2020, which, now Black Square Summer, and it has these small reactionary, urgent causes, but then they often pair off at some point. And there's often this fear that people are speaking up or saying things out of fear of losing alignment with the group, versus a real intention of care and impact and change and social justice. So how can we start to create movements that center care when fear can often be an undercurrent of why people are engaging or acting?
Great. I'm going to need your help to remind me all these questions, but let me start with the last one. It's a great question. And to me, the opportunity is, I think the way we need our progressive social movements to feel is come on in, welcome. It's really fun here. We're going to give you a warm hug, not, you said the wrong thing, or, you don't get to say that because you're not this identity, you're that identity. And I think if we could do that, and within that still have the difficult conversations we need to do about structure and structural racism and structural injustice, it's not about ignoring that stuff, but it's about less focus on language, it's about a bigger we, and I think there are certain things that, if we were starting again on those movements and we were bringing all the influences together, right? I think there would be certain things that I would argue we shouldn't have made core to the movement. So an example would be, it was very popular for a period of time to accuse everybody of cultural appropriation if they were they wore a dress in another person's culture. And while some of those things, for example, were reflections of racism or poorly intended, a lot of them were well-intended things that we nonetheless punished and shamed people for. So getting that distinction right in the way we run our movements, so important, right? Because if we're going to get our values to be shared by more people, we can't do it in a way that feels elitist, obsessed with language, and hierarchical and full of judgment. Remind me your question.
I was kind of saying, are they inherently right-wing? Is it possible to
Right.
have an economically kind of left-wing mobilisation on social media?
I think it's hard to know. I think the short answer is ultimately these guys are going to act in accordance with their economic interests. But I think what Musk shows is that if you're the richest guy in the world, the only thing better than being the richest guy in the world is having political power and influence. And that's what he pulled off with his acquisition of X, which many, including me at the time, kind of scoffed at because it seemed like such a dumb move economically. But it proved to be incredibly clever for him, right? And so, yes, I think people will see these platforms as ideological vehicles. And where I think it's clear Musk is kind of very clearly kind of red-pilled ideologically. I think someone like Zuckerberg, I think there's still some fluidity there, right? Looking at his journey and the people that have influenced him. But it's terrible that we're having this conversation about the whims of one or two people determining the future of our political discourse. And remind me your question.
UK and Britain, are they
Yeah,
the same?
right. So I think, the good news is I do think there are very big differences between the two contexts. And one thing I always think about in terms of the difference between the US and the UK is that when Liz Truss had her sort of lettucey prime ministership, only in the UK compared to America, you would never get 25% of the population switching their voting intentions because of objectively very poor governance and political performance. It just wouldn't happen in the US, right? Because it's so tribal, it's so polarized, and to your point, Ravi, it really is two tribes, two teams. There's a red team and there's a blue team, and those are the teams. Whereas in the UK, it is becoming more and more fractured in terms of the party system, but also it's still ideologically fluid enough that, and there's still a sense of integration, I would say, between political elites of all parties. So in the UK, I'll meet people from the Labour Party, from the Lib Dems, from the Tories, and they'll have somewhat different views, but like they'll often be sitting at the same tables together, they'll be having debates with each other. That just isn't true in the US. Like, these ecosystems are sealed off from each other, and it's like looking at exotic worlds that exist, that you can barely grasp. So I think there are very, very big differences in that context in terms of those things, and that doesn't mean that the populist dynamics and the information environment dynamics that we've talked about today aren't very present in the UK too, and they are, and obviously the Farage story exemplifies that.
Great, thanks. Let's take another couple of questions. Ellie, and later.
Thanks very much. So you both alluded to the fact earlier that for those of us trying to build progressive movements, particularly online, the algorithms are against us. So do you think we should just pack up and go home? You basically have a lot of NGOs who are trying to develop these progressive communication strategies in a very old school way. One comms person funded half, part-time. Is that just a waste of our time? Should we be doing something else? Or should we be trying to compete in this new information environment? Because I think a lot of us are wasting a hell of a lot of time on this for very limited results.
Why don't you just answer that one?
I think it's a great question. I do think that at some point there will be a mass migration to another platform that will provide new opportunities for that. Now, some of that has happened with Blue Sky, but I think as people have correctly pointed out, Blue Sky is a particular rump of kind of progressive thought that is kind of unfortunately replicates some of the problematic dynamics that I mentioned earlier, and it's not very broadly appealing. So you will need a bigger tent that is more ideologically diverse than Blue Sky, but that is less noxious than the existing platforms. So when that happens, I would definitely recommend, packing your belongings and trying to hop on the new ship, right, and joining that. But that hasn't happened yet, right? And I'm not sure that it will. I think in terms of the new environment, I think the biggest piece of advice I would have is you've got to use, I think, the comms strategy that is organizationally centered and very centralized is probably going to have very limited returns. But investing in ecosystems of individuals who can build audiences, who are able to build these personalized and personalistic audiences and carry your messages and values, networks of those kinds of influences, that's still a valuable strategy in the current environment, even with all the limitations that we face.
Great.
Hi, I was wondering, you talked at the end about concerns that migration would be a moving goalpost sort of issue. I'm wondering to what extent you think that migration is currently like an emotional scapegoat due to people's concerns around their own circumstances, so that if you improved general affordability, concerns around migration might reduce? Or do you think it's also tied up in other issues such as conservatism is often related to perceptions that the world's a dangerous place? Is it more related to those bigger issues that are going to take longer to solve, or could like an individual affordability change affect perceptions of migration?
Do you want to answer that, Ravi? Yeah, I think that what these narratives on the migration issue and others do well is tap people's basic sense of unfairness or fairness. People feel like it's unfair that people are skipping the line or taking their jobs, and that's very resonant in the same way that people are told this story about trans folks competing in sports, and even though that's a tiny use case, it taps that sense of like, oh, I think that sounds unfair, right? And so that is very potent if you feel like the society around you is not delivering and giving you the right opportunities. So yes, by that logic, improving people's material conditions would help somewhat, but I don't think that people's existential crisis is limited to the price of their groceries, because I think it's a broader sense of lack of belonging and a sense of lack of direction. I'm not sure it's easily addressed simply by turning up the dial on some of those material factors.
Let's take one question there at the back, and then here. Yeah.
Hello, Jonathan from Root Cause, who work on the future of the information environment. I want to ask about tackling tech power. The New Power is a brilliant book, but its message was build power on social. And social companies have been building power. And if you look at, say, the riots in Nepal this week, right, one of the many reasons, complex situation, that the Nepalese campaigners were so angry was they turned off social because people's businesses are run on social. And when you actually look at the power of technology companies and other problems people seem to think aren't related around trust in institutions, quality of democracy, the financial power of these companies, their GDP dwarfs most countries. 1 in 2 people on the planet use Google or Facebook products. And when you look at their political power, there's one lobbyist per person in Washington. Like there's a lobbyist in Washington per congressman or woman. When you think of all the ways in which the power of these companies is bad for capitalism and bad for democracy, and then you think about the salience of that issue, what do you do about it? Because the intellectual argument is there, but the public and political understanding of it is like very low.
Go for it. Final question there.
Yeah, the short answer is I do think we need to find a way to build a big mass social movement to take on the power of these companies. And it's a really hard issue because it's not, it's not identity-based, it's quite abstract, it's quite technical. But the only answer, in part, is at some point there will need to be an organized social movement with real political power that tries to upend that dynamic.
My question is about the personalities and sort of isolation of many of the people you're talking about, the billionaires, the Sam Altmans, Musks. People who are in their orbit are not really saying no, and they're just sort of getting on with it. They seem very isolated people themselves, and they have a very cynical and perhaps not very optimistic view of where humanity's going. Is that part of the problem as well, that their view is just bleeding into the products that they're creating a more divided world? Because it's their worldview, it's a very personalised view that they're presenting through their products.
I would say, I'm not sure I would describe them as isolated as such. I would say that they operate in a very specific epistemic bubble that is quite eccentric and peculiar. So, and I mean that. When I go to the West Coast and I meet with people in that bubble, I am like, this is very odd. I really mean it. And there's a movie that was made recently called Mountainhead. I don't know if you guys saw it. It's a sort of send-up of this sort of tech elites, and it's not a great movie, but it's a very good example of the peculiarity of their ideology, their language. So they feed each other in that way, and actually their views on AI are part of what shapes the rest of their worldview, because they're all very, very fixated on AI, and they at once believe that AI will end humanity, but also believe that they should enrich themselves enormously while pursuing that goal of making super powerful AI. So I think understanding their ideology is important. Permeating that bubble, really important. Can we reach them? Can we find people who they listen to, who are in their signal chats, that represent a little bit of a broader worldview? I think that's a project, actually, that I've spoken to some people about. And I think ultimately we're going to have to do it, because if we don't puncture that bubble, the world's going to start looking even stranger.
Jeremy, we're going to have to stop there. I have to confess to you, I did actually suggest to my wife that we do couples counselling with a digital significant other, and she nearly sort of went straight to the solicitor. So I'm going to end there. It's been brilliant talking to you, as ever. Really rich conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure.